A city without walls in the ancient world was not a city. It was an open grave. You could build houses, you could even build a temple, but without a wall, you had no security, no identity, and no future. You were just waiting for the next empire to arrive. This was the reality of Jerusalem for nearly a century and a half. When Babylon burned the city to the ground, they did not just destroy buildings. They destroyed the boundary that separated God's people from the rest of the world. Decades later, the exiles returned. They rebuilt the temple, but the walls remained in ruins. For more than 140 years, the stones lay exactly where the Babylonian army had thrown them, blackened by fire, covered in weeds. Generations were born and died walking past the rubble of their own history, accepting the brokenness as normal. And this is where the Book of Nehemiah begins. Not in the dust of Jerusalem, but in the luxury of a Persian palace. Nehemiah, chapter 1, opens in the citadel of Susa. Nehemiah is a Jewish exile, but he has risen to one of the highest positions in the ancient world. He is the cupbearer to the Persian king, Artaxerxes. Most people read that title and think of a servant pouring wine. It was much more than that. The cupbearer was the king's most trusted advisor. He tasted the wine to prevent assassination, which meant he held the king's life in his hands every single day. He had access. He had wealth. He had perfect security. He had everything a man in exile could possibly want. But one day, a group of men arrive from Judah. Nehemiah asks them a simple question about the surviving remnant and the state of Jerusalem. The answer changes the course of biblical history. The remnant there in the province, who had survived the exile, is in great trouble and shame. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are destroyed by fire. The temple was standing, but the city was disgraced. God's name was attached to a place that looked like an abandoned ruin. Notice Nehemiah's reaction. He is a man of action, a high-ranking official who knows how to manage kingdoms. But he does not immediately start drafting blueprints. He does not go to the king to ask for a budget. He does not organize a committee. The text says he sat down and wept. He mourned for days. He fasted. He prayed. When he prays, he does not just ask God to fix the stones. He repents. He says, "We have sinned against you." He includes himself. He is living in a Persian palace, far away from the rubble, yet he identifies with the rebellion that caused the ruin in the first place. He reminds God of the covenant, appealing to the ancient promise that if the people return, God will gather them. This is where the theology of the wall comes into focus. A wall was not just a military defense. In the biblical imagination, the wall was the boundary between the sacred and the common. It was the perimeter of worship. Without it, the temple was exposed. The Sabbath was constantly violated by foreign merchants walking right into the city. The people were losing their distinct identity. The broken wall was a physical mirror of their spiritual condition. This detail is not random. It is the key to the entire project. Before the walls of Jerusalem could be rebuilt, someone had to care that they were broken. Nehemiah allowed the ruin of God's city to break his own heart. He took the shame of a city 1,000 miles away and placed it squarely on his own shoulders. Many people read the story of Nehemiah as a manual for leadership or a guide to ancient construction. But underneath the architecture is a deeper pattern. This is a story about opposition. It is a precise, escalating sequence that reveals exactly how resistance operates when something broken is about to be restored. The rebuilding of the wall was never just about moving stones. It was about closing the gaps where the enemy had easy access. And the enemy knew it. Most people think Nehemiah immediately gathered an army of builders and marched to the site with trumpets blowing. But the text shows that before a single stone was moved, the true work began in absolute silence, under the cover of darkness. The journey from the royal palace in Susa to the ruins of Jerusalem was nearly 1,000 miles. It took months of travel across harsh and dangerous terrain. Nehemiah did not arrive empty-handed. He carried letters of safe passage from the Persian king. He held authorized requisitions for timber from the royal forests. He even arrived with a military escort of cavalry. Most leaders, arriving with that kind of imperial backing, would have organized a parade. They would have blown trumpets, gathered the local officials, and immediately announced their grand vision for the city. Nehemiah does the exact opposite. When he arrives in Jerusalem, he tells no one what God has put in his heart to do. For 3 days, he simply sits in silence. And then, Under the cover of darkness, he takes a midnight ride. Nehemiah chapter 2 describes one of the most haunting and cinematic scenes in the Hebrew Bible. Nehemiah takes a few trusted men and a single animal, and he slips out of the city through the valley gate. He rides south toward the dung gate, the exit where the city's refuse was carried out. He turns toward the fountain gate and the king's pool. As he rides, he is carefully inspecting the walls. He is looking at the charred wooden gates and the massive, fractured stones. At one point, the devastation is so absolute, the rubble is so piled up and tangled that the animal he is riding cannot even find a path to pass through. He has to dismount and navigate the wreckage on foot. It is a portrait of complete and utter ruin. But this midnight ride reveals a profound principle about biblical restoration. Before you can rebuild the wall, you must be willing to look at the rubble. You must face the exact dimensions of the brokenness. Why did he do this in secret? Why at night? Because Nehemiah knew that the city was filled with varying agendas. There were local nobles who had grown comfortable with the ruins. There were neighboring governors who benefited from a weak, defenseless Jerusalem. If Nehemiah had announced his plans before he knew the true condition of the wall, the narrative would have been hijacked. The cynics would have told him the damage was impossible to fix. The comfortable would have told him a wall was unnecessary. He had to see the reality with his own eyes, in the quiet. Before human opinions could cloud the vision, he needed an unvarnished assessment of the damage. Only after he measures the ruin does he call the leaders of the city together. He gathers the priests, the nobles, and the officials. Notice how he speaks to them. He does not point fingers. He does not speak as an outsider judging their generational failure. He says, "You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision." He identifies with them, and then he tells them about the gracious hand of God that has been upon him, and the words the Persian king had spoken. He shifts their eyes from the charred stones to the providence of God. The response of the people is immediate. They say, "Let us rise up and build." After 140 years of apathy, the spiritual atmosphere of the city changes in a single day. The people commit to the work. They strengthen their hands for the good project. The silence of the midnight ride is over. The work is about to begin. But here is what most people miss about spiritual and physical restoration. As long as the wall was broken, the enemy was quiet. As long as the people were comfortable in their ruin, there was no resistance. But the moment the people said, "Let us build," the opposition woke up. The enemy does not contest empty territory. The enemy contests restoration. As the first stones were lifted, the very first tactic of the enemy was deployed. It was not an army. It was not a sword. It was a psychological weapon, designed to break the builders before the wall could even take shape. The moment the work begins, the silence is broken. When you read the Book of Nehemiah, you notice a sudden shift in tone. For 3 chapters, the focus is on prayer, preparation, and careful inspection. But as soon as the first stones are lifted out of the ashes, the opposition arrives. The resistance does not begin with an army. It begins with an audience. 2 men step into the narrative: Sanballat the Horonite and Tobiah the Ammonite. These are regional governors. They are men of influence who have grown very comfortable with a broken, defenseless Jerusalem. Their first tactic is not violence. It is psychological warfare. Nehemiah chapter 4 describes the exact method. Sanballat stands before his associates and the army of Samaria, and he begins to ask a series of sarcastic questions. What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they restore things themselves? Will they finish up in a day? Will they revive the stones out of the heaps of rubbish, and burned ones at that? Then Tobiah steps in with the punchline. Yes, what they are building, if a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. It sounds like childish insults, but this is a highly calculated strategy. Mockery is almost always the first weapon used against restoration. Why? Because mockery does not have to stop the work physically. It only has to break the will of the worker. Sanballat and Tobiah are not speaking to the stones. They are speaking to the identity of the builders. They use the word feeble. They point out the sheer impossibility of the timeline. They highlight the burned, fractured condition of the materials. They are trying to make the builders look at their own hands, look at the charred rubble, and feel ridiculous. Mockery is designed to reframe a holy calling as a pathetic joke. If the enemy can make you feel embarrassed by the smallness of your beginnings, you will drop the tool on your own. Notice exactly how Nehemiah responds. This is one of the most critical moments in the entire sequence. Nehemiah has the authority of the Persian king. He has a military escort. He could have marched out to Samaria and demanded respect. He could have argued with them. He could have pointed to his royal letters to prove his legitimacy. He does none of that. He does not defend the work to the mockers. He speaks directly to God. "Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunt on their own heads." He takes the insult, bypasses the enemy, and places it on the altar. He lets God defend the honor of the project. And then, the text gives us one of the most profound, understated sentences in the book. "So we built the wall." No argument, no public debate, just the steady, heavy sound of stone scraping against stone. The text says the people had a mind to work, and the wall reached half its height. That sounds like a victory. It is. But here is what most people miss about the anatomy of opposition. When the enemy realizes that psychological warfare is failing, they do not surrender. They escalate. Sanballat and Tobiah watched the wall rise to half its height. The gaps were closing. The joke was no longer funny. Words had failed to stop the builders. So the enemy realized they had to change their strategy. The psychological war was about to become physical. When mockery fails, the enemy does not retreat. They regroup. In Nehemiah chapter 4, the builders have reached a critical milestone. The gaps in the wall are being closed. The broken pieces are finally connecting. And that is exactly when the opposition shifts from sarcastic insults to the threat of physical violence. Look at the geography of the resistance. Sanballat is to the north. Tobiah and the Ammonites are to the east. The Arabs are to the south. The Ashdodites are to the west. Jerusalem is completely encircled. The text says they all plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. The strategy is psychological terror combined with the threat of ambush. The enemies begin spreading rumors. They say, "They will not know or see till we come among them and kill them and stop the work." 10 different times, Jewish people living near the enemies come to Jerusalem and warn the builders, "From all the places where they live, they will come up against us." The constant threat of violence begins to take a toll. The workers are already exhausted. The rubble is heavy. The days are long. And now, they have to look over their shoulders constantly, wondering if a blade is coming from the shadows. A song of despair actually rises up among the people of Judah. They say, "The strength of the burden bearers is failing. There is too much rubble. By ourselves, we will not be able to rebuild the wall." This is the breaking point. If Nehemiah ignores the threat and just tells them to pray, the people will scatter in fear. If he stops the building to form an army, the enemy wins, because the work halts. So Nehemiah does something that has become a masterpiece of biblical leadership. First, he says, "We prayed to our God and set a guard as a protection against them day and night." Notice the sequence. Prayer first, then practical defense. Not just theology, not just strategy. Both. Nehemiah places people in the lowest, most exposed parts of the wall. But he does not station them as individuals. He stations them by families. He puts fathers next to sons and brothers next to brothers. He arms them with swords, spears, and bows. He knows that a man will fight differently when he is standing in front of his own home, looking at his own children. He tells them, "Do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord, who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes." When the enemies hear that the plot is known, the element of surprise is gone. God frustrates their plan. But Nehemiah knows the threat is not over. So he institutes a new system. From that day on, half of his servants work on construction, and half hold the spears, shields, bows, and coats of mail. And for the builders themselves, the text gives us one of the most enduring images in all of Scripture. Those who carried burdens labored in such a way that each worked with one hand and held a weapon with the other. And each of the builders had his sword strapped at his side while he built. A tool in one hand, a weapon in the other. The work is spread out. The wall is vast. If an attack comes, they will be too far apart to hear a human voice. So Nehemiah keeps the trumpeter standing right next to him at all times. He tells the nobles and the people, "Wherever you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there." Our God will fight for us. The project continues. They work from the break of dawn until the stars come out. They do not even take off their clothes to sleep. They keep their weapons in their hands. The physical threats from the outside are neutralized by absolute, relentless vigilance. The wall continues to rise. The perimeter is secure, but just as the people find their rhythm, the entire project is nearly destroyed by a sudden, devastating crisis. And this time, the enemy is not outside the gates. The swords were drawn. The guards were posted. The perimeter was secure. Sanballat and Tobiah had tried mockery, and it failed. They had tried the threat of ambush, and it failed. The wall was rising, and the external enemies could not find a way in. But in Nehemiah chapter 5, the building suddenly stops. It does not stop because of an attack from the north. It stops because of a cry from within. This is the third tactic of opposition, and it is almost always the most dangerous. When a restoration project cannot be destroyed from the outside, it will be tested by rot on the inside. A massive outcry rises up among the people, but they are not crying out against the Sumerians or the Ammonites. The text says it was a great outcry of the people and their wives against their Jewish brothers. While the men were on the wall holding swords and trowels, a severe economic crisis had silently crushed their families. There was a famine. To buy grain just to survive, families had been forced to mortgage their fields, their vineyards, and their houses. To pay the heavy taxes demanded by the Persian king, they had to borrow money from the wealthy nobles of Judah. And when the money ran out, they had to do the unthinkable. They were forced to sell their own sons and daughters into slavery to pay their debts. Jewish people were exploiting Jewish people. The wealthy were charging heavy interest to the poor, profiting off their brothers during a national crisis. This is the ultimate paradox of the project. They were building a massive wall to keep the oppressive nations out, while acting exactly like the oppressive nations inside. What good is a wall if the community it protects is devouring itself? When Nehemiah hears this, he is furious. The text says, "I was very angry when I heard their outcry in these words." But notice what he does next. He does not lash out in a blind rage. He does not ignore the problem to keep the schedule moving. The text says he took counsel with himself. He paused. He thought it over. And then, he brought charges against the nobles and the officials. He calls a great assembly. He publicly exposes the injustice. He tells them, "We, as far as we are able, have bought back our Jewish brothers who have been sold to the nations, but you even sell your brothers that they may be sold to us." The nobles are entirely silent. They have no defense. Nehemiah demands immediate restoration. He tells them to return the fields, the vineyards, the olive orchards, and the houses that very day. He demands they forgive the debt and stop charging interest. He is effectively saying that the spiritual integrity of the people is more important than the speed of the construction. He halts the work of the stones to fix the hearts of the builders. The nobles agree. They say, "We will restore these and require nothing from them." Nehemiah makes them take an oath, and the entire assembly praises God. The crisis is averted. The internal breach is healed. By confronting the injustice head-on, Nehemiah removes the rot that would have hollowed out the city from within. The unity of the people is restored. They return to the wall, and the work accelerates. The gaps are finally closed. The stones reach their full height. The only things left to install are the massive wooden doors in the gates. Sanballat and Tobiah watch this happening. They are running out of time. Mockery failed. Violence failed. Internal division failed. So they launch their most subtle, sophisticated, and dangerous attack yet. They pivot from attacking the wall to isolating the man leading the work. The internal crisis was healed. The unity of the people held. And the stones of the wall finally formed a complete, unbroken circle around Jerusalem. Nehemiah chapter 6 opens with a crucial detail. The wall had been rebuilt, and there was no breach left in it. The only things missing were the massive wooden doors for the gates. This is the turning point of the project. And it is the moment the enemy completely changes their strategy. Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem, the Arab, realize that the wall is no longer vulnerable. They cannot tear down the stones. They cannot divide the workers. The structure itself is too strong, so they pivot. If they cannot destroy the work, they must remove the leader. This is the fourth tactic of opposition. It does not look like an attack. It looks like an invitation. Sanballat and Geshem send a message to Nehemiah. They say, "Come and let us meet together at Hakaphirim in the plain of Ono." It sounds like diplomacy. It sounds like a reasonable request for a peace summit. The wall is built, tensions are high, and the regional governors want to sit down and talk. But look at the geography. The plain of Ono was located near the Mediterranean coast, roughly 25 miles northwest of Jerusalem. It was a border region, neutral territory. To get there, Nehemiah would have to leave the city. He would have to travel through the open countryside, away from his guards, away from the safety of the newly built walls, and walk right into an exposed valley. The text is blunt about their true motive. Nehemiah says, "But they intended to do me harm." When the enemy cannot stop a restoration project through violence or internal division, they will try to stop it through distraction. They will offer a conversation. They will ask for a compromise. They knew that if Nehemiah left the city, the workers would pause. The momentum would break. The doors would not be hung. Nehemiah's response is one of the most defining statements in the entire book. He does not send an army. He does not write an angry refusal. He simply sends messengers with a profound declaration of priority. "I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you?" Notice what he is doing. He refuses to elevate their distraction to the level of his calling. He does not debate their terms. He simply points to the work. But the opposition does not give up easily. The text says they sent this exact same message to him 4 times. This is the weapon of persistent fatigue. The enemy hopes that if they ask enough times, Nehemiah will eventually give in just to silence them. They are trying to wear out his resolve through sheer repetition. And 4 times, Nehemiah gives them the exact same answer. "I am doing a great work. I cannot come down." This reveals a deep biblical truth about the nature of resistance. Opposition does not always come holding a sword. Sometimes it comes holding a truce. It offers a reasonable compromise, knowing that stepping away from the wall for even a few days could permanently break the vision. Nehemiah refused to leave. He refused to step into the open plain. He would not be lured out of the city. Since Sanballat and Tobiah could not pull Nehemiah into a physical ambush, they realized they had to change their angle one last time. If they could not assassinate his body in the plain of Ono, they would assassinate his character right inside the walls of Jerusalem. They launched their 5th and final tactic: a direct, coordinated assault on his reputation, his motives, and his faith. The invitation to the plain of Ono had failed. Nehemiah refused to leave the city, so the enemy deployed their 5th and final tactic. If they could not lure him into a physical ambush, they would destroy his character from the inside out. Sanballat sends his servant to Nehemiah for a 5th time, but this time, he sends him holding a letter. The text includes a small, easily overlooked detail about this letter. It says the letter was open. In the ancient Near East, official correspondence between governors and leaders was always rolled, tied, and sealed with clay. The seal guaranteed that the message was private and secure. An open letter was something entirely different. An open letter was not meant just for the recipient. It was meant to be read by every messenger, every servant, and every merchant along the road. It was a public broadcast. It was weaponized gossip. Sanballat wanted the contents of this letter to spread through the streets of Jerusalem before it ever reached Nehemiah's hands. And the contents were devastating. The letter claimed that it was reported among the nations that Nehemiah and the Jews were planning to rebel against the Persian Empire. It claimed that this was the real reason they were building the wall. It even accused Nehemiah of hiring prophets to proclaim him as the new king of Judah. This was not just an insult. It was a death sentence. If a rumor of treason reached the ears of King Artaxerxes, the Persian army would march on Jerusalem and burn it to the ground. Sanballat ends the letter with a thinly veiled threat. "Now this report will come to the king. Therefore come, and let us take counsel together." It is political blackmail. Stop the work, meet with us, or we will tell the king you are leading a rebellion. Nehemiah does not panic. He does not hold a press conference to defend his reputation. He sends a 1-sentence reply. "No such things as you say have been done, for you are inventing them out of your own mind." And then he prays, "Now, O God, strengthen my hands." But the opposition was not finished. Having failed with political slander, they pivot to their most insidious trap yet. They decide to use the language of faith against him. Nehemiah goes to visit a man named Shemaiah, who is confined to his home, Shemaiah claims to have a prophetic word from God. He tells Nehemiah, "Let us meet together in the house of God, within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. They are coming to kill you by night." It sounds like a lifeline. It sounds like wise, spiritual counsel. A prophet is offering him sanctuary in the holiest, safest place in the city. But there is a massive theological problem hidden in this invitation. Nehemiah is from the tribe of Judah. He is a cupbearer, a governor, and a builder. He is not a priest. According to the law of Moses, only the priests were allowed inside the holy place of the temple. For an ordinary Israelite to bypass the altar and hide inside the sanctuary was a direct violation of the covenant. If Nehemiah had given in to fear and run into the temple, he would have broken the very law he was trying to protect. The text reveals that Shemaiah was not speaking for God. He had been hired by Sanballat and Tobiah. They wanted Nehemiah to act out of terror. They knew that if he violated the temple to save his own life, he would lose his moral authority instantly. The people would see him as a hypocrite and a coward. His reputation would be ruined, and the project would collapse. Nehemiah sees right through it. He answers the false prophet with absolute clarity. "Should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I could go into the temple and live? I will not go in." He refused to sacrifice his integrity for his security. They had tried mockery. They had tried the threat of violence. They had tried to exploit internal division. They had tried diplomatic distraction. And finally, they had tried spiritual compromise and slander. They threw every possible weapon at the builders. But despite the relentless psychological, physical, and spiritual warfare, the work on the stones never stopped. And then, the calendar reached a day that would echo through the surrounding nations. On the 52nd day, the sound of chisels and heavy stones suddenly stopped. The wall was finished on the 25th day of the month of Elul. It took exactly 52 days. Think about the sheer impossibility of that timeline. The walls of Jerusalem were massive. They had been in ruins for 140 years. The builders were not professional masons. They were perfumers, goldsmiths, priests, and merchants. They were exhausted, working with one hand on a trowel and the other on a sword. And yet, the entire perimeter was closed in less than 2 months. Notice the reaction of the surrounding nations. For weeks, Sanballat, Tobiah, and the surrounding enemies had mocked the work. They threatened violence. They tried to organize a rebellion. They tried character assassination. But Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 16, records what happened when the final door was hung in the gate. "And when all our enemies heard of it, all the nations around us were afraid and fell greatly in their own esteem, for they perceived that this work had been accomplished with the help of our God." The mockery ended. The threats dissolved, not because Nehemiah fought them, not because he argued with them, but because the completed work became undeniable proof that God was dwelling among his people again. If you are reading the Book of Nehemiah as a standard historical record, you would expect the story to end right there. The wall is built, the gates are shut, the city is safe. Roll the credits. But the book does not end in chapter 6. There are 7 more chapters. And this is where the deeper theology of the wall is finally revealed. Once the perimeter is secure, the people do not throw a massive party to celebrate their architecture. They do not build monuments to Nehemiah. Instead, in Nehemiah chapter 8, the entire nation gathers as one in the square before the water gate. They call for a man named Ezra the scribe. They ask him to bring out the book of the law of Moses. Ezra stands on a wooden platform. He opens the scroll, and as soon as he opens it, all the people stand up. For the next 6 hours, from early morning until midday, the people listen to the word of God. The Levites move through the crowd, translating and explaining the text so that everyone can understand it. When the people hear the words, they begin to weep. They realize how far they have drifted from the covenant. This is the true climax of the book. The goal was never just to build a physical barrier. A wall can keep foreign armies out, but it cannot heal the heart of a nation. A wall can protect a city, but it cannot make a city holy. The wall was only a prerequisite. It was the necessary boundary that allowed the people to be gathered, secured, and reformed by the word of God. This is why the opposition was so intense. Sanballat and Tobiah did not care about limestone and wood. They cared about what the wall represented. They knew that if the wall was finished, the identity of Israel would be restored. The Sabbath would be protected. The worship at the temple would be purified. The enemy was not fighting a construction project. They were fighting a spiritual resurrection. When you look back at the entire sequence of opposition, the pattern becomes clear. The enemy will always contest the spaces where God is trying to rebuild you. They will start with mockery, hoping you will drop the tools out of shame. If you keep building, they will threaten your peace, hoping you will freeze in fear. If you stand your ground, they will try to rot the work from the inside through division. If you resolve the conflict, they will offer a diplomatic compromise, trying to pull you into the open plain. And if you refuse to leave the work, they will attack your character. But Nehemiah's response remains the blueprint for anyone standing in the rubble. He did not lower his sword. He did not negotiate with the mockers. He did not compromise the sanctuary. He simply kept his hands on the stone and his eyes on the God of heaven. The story of Nehemiah was never just an ancient account of urban renewal. It was the quiet architecture of redemption.